Welcome back to the Ace Talks podcast, where we talk about Ecuador and a little more. And today's topic is pretty interesting, as you could probably already tell by the title of this video. Is the grass greener on the other side? And the more interesting thing about this topic is the fact that, honestly, I had not given a name for it. I was thinking of what exactly would be the title of this episode until I actually saw one of my good friend Don Shader's videos about a month ago. And in his video, he talks about the grass being greener on the other side syndrome. And let me give you the definition. The grass is greener syndrome means that you have the inability to feel content with your life as is and relentlessly seek something better. It is not an actual mental health diagnosis, but it can still be a serious psychological issue that negatively affects your daily life. So while that is interesting and all, how exactly does it relate to a person coming to Ecuador or wanting to come to Ecuador or retire or live in Ecuador? And the thing is, there's this mentality that people coming to Ecuador from anywhere around the world that they have, where they actually have this belief that life is going to be better here. And before you take this the wrong way, I'm not saying that the life that you're gonna have here is necessarily gonna be worse, but there's a lot of things that come into play with this. And there's an interesting comparison when it comes to the mentality of people coming here and what people here actually think. And there's honestly two words that go hand in hand with this whole situation. One that's a little bit more positive, and the other one that has a bit of a negative connotation. While not being completely bad, you just will notice that it's not as good as the positive reason for why people decide to leave in the first place. But you'll notice exactly what they are in the process of this episode. But just to make the grass is greener syndrome a little bit clearer for those who might not completely understand it, I'm going to use an example of my own life. Because as many of you already know, I did not live in Ecuador my whole life. At this point, I could say Ecuador and the time that I lived in the States, because I originally lived in the States, pretty much have a split, 50-50 time lived in each place. And the thing about the life that I lived in the States is the fact that in the contrast to what a lot of people who come to Ecuador, the idea that they have that they really want to come to Ecuador, I really did not want to come to Ecuador. So the process for me to come over here was a little bit more, I guess you would say, complex. I had to really convince myself about the good things about coming to Ecuador. Among these good things was the beauty, because a lot of people told me that Ecuador was a beautiful country. The other thing was the cheapness. Basically things being cheap here, because they told me that everything was cheaper in comparison to the United States. And one of the last things that I used to try to convince myself that things were going to be fine over here in Ecuador was the fact that I was going to be able to continue my life as everything was in the States, just over here in Ecuador. But remember, this was me trying to see the grass be greener on the other side, the grass be greener in Ecuador, in comparison to the life that I lived in the United States. The reality, unfortunately, was not exactly up to the expectation that I had set for it. So the reality that I ran into with Ecuador was the fact that it was actually beautiful. As a country and as a place with nature, it is very beautiful. But the thing is, the way that I view beauty as a person who was raised in the city and who really loves the city, like city life and city appearance, when I ran into the reality of Ecuador, because the first place that I went to was Guayaquil, was the fact that the city itself was not aesthetically what I would have wanted in a city, especially comparing it to the city that I lived in. And I originally lived in Plantation, which, if people don't know, is a city in Florida. Really, the buildings did not have a very aesthetic look to them. The streets had holes in them and they did not look nice. And in general, the environment was not one that I personally would say, as a city boy, that I would say, oh, this is amazing. It left much to be desired for the expectations that I had set for it. And honestly, once again, not ugly Ecuador, just not the way that I would have wanted the city to be. Then we go into the cheapness of everything. And to be honest, Ecuador is very cheap. I think that's one of the things that I will always highlight about Ecuador until things decide to change, because as many may know who have watched my YouTube channel or have listened to me talk, Ecuador is gradually getting more expensive, little by little. There are changes that you might not notice, but we'll go into that a little bit later on. But the point being that Ecuador is very cheap, especially when you talk about food and overall things. Unfortunately, things like technology are very expensive here. And for someone like me, who is a big fan of technology, especially smartphones and gaming, it's just way out of there in comparison to the States. And it's not just that it's now. It was something that I experienced even worse when I got here. See, the thing is, for someone like me who likes gaming and technology and smartphones and such, when I got here, I really wanted more video games, gaming consoles. I wanted the newest smartphone because I thought things were going to be cheaper here. But that just wasn't the reality. Things like gaming consoles cost double what they cost in the States. Video games were marked up a minimum of $30 to a maximum of $50 plus, which was basically 2 times the cost of a normal video game. And when it came to smartphones, don't even gotta talk about it, because that just was terrible in its own way. And on the technology end, things really haven't gotten any better. Food and other stuff generally has been good to me, and the price of clothing and stuff like that, if you go for name brand, just like in the States, you're gonna find expensive name brand clothing, but if you go for normal cheap clothing, you can't find it here. So there is cheapness to be found, just not exactly in the areas that I wish I could find cheapness in. And then going into structuring my life the same way that I wanted to in the States, there just was no way. And that was my own fault for setting an unrealistic expectation for that, because first of all, interacting with people, just if I was bad at it in the States, because yes, believe it or not, I was a very shy person and had a very limited group of friends, limited to the neighborhood that I lived in, and limited to the group of people who shared a common interest at the school. Here, it just made it very difficult. The fact that I didn't know Spanish, the language barrier really does hold you back a lot when you're trying to get to know people. The only good thing, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit later on, which is one of the key terms for this whole episode, is the fact that people wanted to talk to me because of the life that I lived in a different country. So on that end, it wasn't impossible to make friends. It just wasn't the easiest thing to do because we had problems communicating. Then we go into the fact that I'm a person who really loves sports. Specifically, there are 2 sports that I'm a gigantic fan of. A fan of doing, not of watching, by the way. One is American football. Ever since I was a child, when I was younger in the States, I always played street football, and I was always super interested in getting into the football league. I actually wanted to play football professionally. It is a frustrated dream of mine, which unfortunately I won't live the way that I wanted to live, like in the States, playing on a team professionally. But it is a dream that, in a way, I continue living in some way over here with the community football league. So it's not completely dead. It's just not the thing that I expected, and it took much longer than I would have liked it to. And then the other sport that I had a high interest in, not as much anymore, is track and field. I was a mid to long distance runner, and while I can still run mid to long distances, when I got here, it just wasn't the same. And the same thing with American football. I have talked about it before, but at least when I got here, American football was not a thing. And track and field, unfortunately, did not work the same way it did in the United States, at least at a high school level. So when I got here and I got into high school, I wasn't able to run for the track team because there was no high school track team. And in general, around the country, there are no high school sports teams in general. I was about to say track again, but in all honesty, high schools don't have sports teams. The sports teams are mainly teams that are in the federation, and the federation is pretty much like when you go to the next level of professionalism. Yes, there are junior leagues in the federation. You can join the federation as a kid to be built up little by little in the sport that you like and become a professional at it. But it's not like in the States where you're in a high school, you get scouted by a college, and you go on to play professionally the sport that you trained in. Over here, it's all through the federation. Some high schools do offer sports training for specific sports, but it's not like the United States where you have a team in the high school that competes with another team in another high school, and then there's a division, then maybe nationals. It's nothing like that. Over here, everything goes through the federation. But anyways, when I got here, sports are, and in some way they still are, a very important part of my life. And I just wasn't able to continue doing them the same way that I did them in the States. I did join the federation, which, like you heard just a while ago, is something that pretty much lets you go into the professional part of being an athlete here in Ecuador, but it just wasn't the same. Then we go into the fact of how I was living my life over in the States, where obviously I would have days where I would go out in the neighborhood, play American football out on the street football with my friends. There were days where I went out to play laser tag, which was something very recent for me when I was in the States at that time. And it was just really, really fun going to the mall, being able to walk around the mall for a long amount of time and hang out with friends. It was different. And the reason it was different was because over here, there was no laser tag. There was no big mall to walk around. There was no street football. Even street soccer is not really the biggest thing. If you want to play street soccer, you rent out a field and you play on that field, which obviously is more legal than what we used to do in the States because we used to play on the street with the cars, but it's still just not the same. It wasn't the same then, it's not the same now. And not to even mention the food, which obviously I had a specific way of eating in the States, which was completely unhealthy, by the way. So the person you see now, or that you've seen if you watched my YouTube videos, is a much healthier person than I was in the States, because in the States, it was always a box of chicken wings or a box of pizza, heating up waffles or pancakes, eating cereal. But most of the health decisions that I've made in my life at this point in my life aren't because I came to Ecuador, not at all. They're health decisions that I made based on me wanting to have a healthier lifestyle overall. But basically, overall, what I want you to understand with the whole story that I just told you is the fact that when I came to Ecuador, I had set this, I guess, unrealistic expectation. I thought that the grass would definitely be greener, trying to convince myself that coming to Ecuador was a good thing in comparison to the life that I was already living in the States, which I already considered was a good thing. But sadly, it wasn't. When I came here, and there's a lot more things that I'll talk about later on, but not just me, examples of other people who live here. But the fact being that things just weren't great when I got here to Ecuador. And I can't even say that things are great now, because now as a working adult, there's a lot more things that complicate life here in Ecuador. But now let's go back to the mentality of a person coming to live in Ecuador and how similar that mentality is to a person who actually wants to leave Ecuador. And this is where we go back into this whole grass is greener syndrome, because a lot of people who come to Ecuador to retire, to live in, travel to, they have the same mentality as an Ecuadorian wanting to leave Ecuador. Literally, the thought process is the same, just the explanation is obviously different. For people coming to live in Ecuador, they believe that economically, it is cheaper. And this, for the most part, is true. As I've mentioned many times on my YouTube channel, as I've mentioned even previously in this episode, it is true. But the explanation for someone wanting to go to the United States in the same way, speaking about money, is the fact that over there, they can make more money and they can buy things cheaper. You see how similar that thought process is? So people coming from the States, obviously with the pension that they have, they get things cheaper because they have more money and they get to save more while they're living here. People going to the States have a better chance of getting a good job that's going to pay much more than what they're earning over here, and that's what I hear from everyone. And over there, they're going to be able to buy things, such as tech, for cheaper. Of course, they are sacrificing the cheapness of food and produce, but they do get some things that are cheaper. And they even have some left over if they have family in Ecuador to send to Ecuador. This is also a good time to mention the first term that I think pretty much sums up both sides, the positive term, which is opportunity. And people coming to Ecuador and people going to the States, they're both seeking the same thing, and it is opportunity. And the opportunity, like we just noticed, it really varies from which country you're coming from. Because there are people who come to Ecuador, not from the United States, but from Latin America itself. I have a friend who came from Cuba, who I talked to him, I asked him, what was your reason for coming from Cuba to Ecuador? Was it a good decision? And he said 100 times yes. He was like, obviously the opportunities that you have in a place like Ecuador are much better than the ones that you have in a place like Cuba. But he also stated that if he had the chance to go to the United States, he would take it because the opportunities he has over there are much more than the ones that he has over here. And that, obviously for a ton of reasons. One, going into the level of corruption that Ecuador and Ecuadorians face on a day-by-day basis, corruption, crime, and things like that, which we talk about all the time, which are realities no matter where you go, which is why this argument is so ironically funny. But the fact that over there, he just feels that everything, every opportunity he has is much better than what he lives through in Ecuador, which, if you notice, is very ironic to what you might think if you're living in the States. Because if you're living in the States, and this is something that I see in my comment section all the time in my YouTube videos, the fact that when you live in the States, you have this idea, I guess, of Ecuador, that there's this opportunity for things to be cheaper and to escape the immediate danger that you might be feeling in the United States. Mass shootings, maybe the situation with political unrest, things constantly evolving at a pace that maybe you just don't like or aren't used to. All of these things lead you to believe that there's a better opportunity for you if you come to Ecuador. But look at how reverse these two things are. Look at how one side wants to live the reality that the other side no longer wants to live. And of course, you could say that this is something that just people say and they don't really know the reality. And you would say, oh, but they haven't been over here, so they don't know what to really expect. I could probably say the same thing about many people who watch my channel and make the comment of things are probably better over here in Ecuador, but you haven't been in Ecuador. And see, this is why I had to interview not just people who want to go to the United States, but friends and family who actually do live or have lived in the United States. So first, let's look at the case of a really good friend of mine who left at this point about 4 years ago, maybe 5. And he went to the States, went through the process. It was a bit complex, but he's now been living there, like I said, 4 to 5 years. I sent him a message, detailed audio, asking him if you could come back to Ecuador, would you come back to Ecuador? Like, his case is very special actually because he has a family who has a business and they're doing relatively well. And he really had, I guess you could say, a good lifestyle. He had his car, his family's over here. He was fine. I asked him, would you come back to Ecuador? And do you regret the decision you made to go to the States? He told me going to the States was the best freaking, to not say the other word, choice that he made in his life. And of course, he said that's not to say that he doesn't love his country. He loves Ecuador. But in the States, there's a better opportunity in salary. There's better security. There's more facility to get the things that he wants. And in general, it's just a better opportunity overall for him living in the States. He misses the food over here. He misses the cheapness of encebollados, which are about $2 or less. But it's the sacrifice that he had to make in order to live what he considers to be a better life in the States. And once again, this is not an isolated incident. This is not just my friend, a guy living in the States who feels that his life is better over there. I have a friend, a girl, and she's living in the States and she believes her life is much better over there because her vision, her goals, the things that she projected for her life she was not going to be able to accomplish them here. The dream that she has is one that she can only construct being outside of the country. Because she even said that she does love Ecuador, but she doesn't plan on living in Ecuador, but she also doesn't plan on living forever in the United States. At least up till now, that's her thought process. Her life is probably somewhere else. And I'm happy for her. I'm happy for my friend who's living his best life in the States. I'm happy for everyone who makes the choice to go to a different place and they're living the best life they can. And the reason why I'm happy for them, and I'd be happy for anyone who's deciding to come to Ecuador, to live in Ecuador, to retire to Ecuador, to just travel to Ecuador, is because you're taking advantage of an opportunity that you probably don't have in the place that you're in. But now let's get into the more negative side of this whole conversation. And this goes into the negative term that I mentioned earlier. Well, I didn't mention it, but that I said I was going to mention later on in this episode. And that's the situation with idealization. And there's a situation here for both sides of the argument, for people going to the States and people coming from the States to Ecuador, or from another country to Ecuador, where there's an idealization of everything, unfortunately. Now, let's be specific as to what I mean in terms of idealization. We go back to the situation of things being beautiful, but when we look at beautiful, like I said, we define it in different ways. For me, beautiful was city life. For a lot of people, beautiful is the countryside. Beautiful is seeing nature in its full beauty without anyone interfering with it. But the thing is, when you come to live in Ecuador, unless you go isolate yourself someplace in nature, you live in the city. And a lot of the times people come here, Airbnbs, hotels, and they notice that the structure, the way that it's constructed, it's not good. The more popular name brand ones, of course, you can always argue those are going to be perfect. And of course, there's always going to be room for argument in saying not every place is like this. But unfortunately, we're talking about the country as a whole. And unfortunately, a large percent of the country is like this. Then there's also this strange idealization of people. And first I'll start with the idealization that people from here have of people in the United States. And how ironic, if you're from the States, you might think it is for people to have that idealization based on the thoughts that you have. Let me clarify. So the point being that a lot of people from Ecuador, a lot of people who live in Ecuador, when they see an American, it's like seeing the next level thing. Of course, there's exceptions. There are people who say, oh, they're not the last soda in the desert, which is an expression mainly to say like they're not a big deal. But there are a lot of people who, when they see someone from a different country, not necessarily just the States, but a different country overall, they're always fascinated to see how they are, the politeness, the way that they treat you is different, soft-spoken sometimes, kind. And I know a lot of these things that I'm mentioning right now, for some people you might say, are we really talking about Americans? Are we really talking about foreigners? Isn't that how Ecuadorians are? And that's the funny thing about idealization. It goes both ways. When a lot of people who I talk to from the States, a lot of people who come from a foreign country, they talk about Ecuadorians, it's always that idealization. They're so friendly, they're so nice, they're so kind, they invite you into their houses. But you see how something like that could end up mixing with the actual reality of how people are? Because let me put it to you in a different way. When you go into someone's house for the first time, be it your friend, maybe your couple, do you go crazy and just show yourself 100% as you are, like, oh, shoes off, burping, passing gas, I don't know, doing things that you would do in your house or in your normal environment? I would assume, and I might be wrong in assuming, but that for the majority, you would probably say, no, I go into someone else's house and I'm on my best behavior. Well, then look at it the same way as when you go into someone else's country. People who come from the States to Ecuador, most of the time, you come, do your things, you're super chill, you don't have the stress of work, the stress of everyday life, so there's no reason for you to be in 100% aggressive mode like you would think that a lot of Americans are. Not me thinking that, because honestly, when I lived in the States, I had a similar perspective that a lot, except for some classmates who We'll talk about my life in the States at a later date, but some people who I knew were not kind to me at all, Americans. The point being that when Americans come here, people perceive them as something that even they themselves don't believe they are, because that's what they show themselves to be to people over here. And vice versa, when you just meet someone for the first time, an Ecuadorian meeting an American, a European, or someone else, the first thing you do is be on your best behavior, because the first impression is really important. So you don't behave the exact way you would behave with your friend who you behaved your whole life, with people who you have a lot more trust in, if you will. So there is this idealization that people from the States believe that people from Ecuador, amazingly kind. But yes, of course they're going to be amazingly kind for you because they just met you, they might not get to see you for a long time, so they're going to treat you well. And vice versa, people coming from the States are going to look extremely kind, and I really believe that a lot of people from the States are extremely kind, by the way. Same thing with people in Ecuador. It's just the way that the first impression works is not the reality. And this is pretty much where the problem and why I'm having this whole conversation with you. This is where the problem comes into play. The fact that when you come to a country like Ecuador, or when people from Ecuador go to a place like the United States, there's this idea that things are just going to be perfect. There's this idea, the idealization that you made, the thought that the grass is greener on the other side. Maybe because of the life that you live, because you really have to think about the things that are surrounding you in your everyday life. Basically, what is your current situation like? Where do you live? What exactly do you have to put up with that's either so bad that you can't stay in the place that you're at, or that you think another place would end up resolving? What is your cost of living? Because if it's very expensive, I can understand why you would want to come to a country like Ecuador to make things cheaper. And the same thing over here, but in another sense, how much are you earning? For people here who earn so little, the opportunity to earn a lot, and by doing a little, is really enticing. Which is kind of sad, because if people put in the same mentality of doing really hard work and earning a lot of money here, they could probably live a very decent, stable lifestyle. But obviously, I guess people strive for more, which is understandable as well. The point being that the circumstances that you live in, the circumstances that you live with, will dictate just how much better your life would be in a different country. And you also, I want you to think about it, because a lot of people come because there's this fear of how things could get. But what's the guarantee that things are actually going to be that way? For example, people are already leaving Ecuador, and they have been for the past couple of years, because they just see how the situation has been getting worse. There's no way for anyone who lives here and who has lived here long enough to deny that the situation in Ecuador is bad. People from the outside are not going to see it. People from the outside who come here and who isolate themselves are not going to see it. But people who live the everyday Ecuadorian life, you're going to notice it in your everyday Ecuadorian life. Before you come here, really think about how bad your situation is where you're living. Is it so bad that you really can't put up with it anymore? Or is it just bad to the level where you're being scared into trying to find a better place? In that same way, if your decision is set to come to Ecuador, then obviously I want you to come to Ecuador and I want you to interact with the people. If that's not your objective, I'm not going to force you to do it. If you want to come here and isolate yourself and live with expat communities, there's plenty of expat communities, which I can't mention now, of course, because I'd have to research more into them. But I know there's one in Crucita. I know in every beach city there's one, because Ecuadorians talk about it all the time. There's a literal section of every beach city where you will find a bunch of gringos, a bunch of Americans, a bunch of Europeans, a bunch of expats, literally who just keep to themselves and live their lives in that city, isolated from the actual Ecuadorian populace. But I want you to interact if you're here, and if you want to, interact with the Ecuadorians. Get to really understand the lifestyle here. And then, once you know what the reality is over here, then you can decide, is Ecuador the really ideal grass on the other side country that you were expecting? Or were your expectations just really high because the life that you lived in the States or wherever you came from was just really that bad? So those are just my thoughts. And of course, there's so much more to talk about this situation. There's so much more I would like to dive into, but we'll leave it for a different time. If you would like me to go into it at a different time, of course, please let me know. You can contact me through my email, which is gmacemb@gmail.com. Or you can go to my YouTube channel, leave me a comment at my YouTube channel, GMAce. But if not, there's much more things to talk about in the future, so definitely stay tuned for future episodes of the Ace Talks podcast. And for now, I will leave you with, I really hope that if you come to Ecuador, if you decide to retire in Ecuador, if you want to live in Ecuador, that do your research, come prepared. That's what I always try to do on this channel, on these podcast episodes. Try to make sure you're prepared. So come prepared, take care of yourself, and as always, Ace out.